Welcome back, warriors, to another blood-splattered battle that is the... It's time to talk about the tonguing of the fat slaughter man. Ever since I first started this journey, this quest, this mission of finding what I truly believe to be the worst fighting game, plenty, or I should say, too many of you have inundated me with requests to take on the jiggling terror of Tongue of the Fat Man, or actually no, Slaughter Sport, that's the one. Wait, no, Mondu's Fight Palace? To take on this legendarily bad fighting game that is both insanely obscure, but still somehow insanely infamous. Whether you're playing it on MS-DOS, the Genesis/Mega Drive, or even the lowly Commodore, it seems like no one has anything good to say about this, thing. But the question is, will said lack of positive word of mouth be nearly enough to dethrone the barely functional fuckery of the oily man bodies of Pit Fighter SNES? Well, we won't know for sure until we get it in the ring! Back in the late 80s and early 90s, Activision was a company that most gamers associated with having a fairly solid rep, but a lot of the time also made some eccentric business decisions. Their output ran the gamut from classics like Pitfall, MechWarrior, and Zork to conversions of Ghostbusters, Predator, and Double Dragon for the Atari 2600. One of, well, perhaps the most bizarre event in their early publishing history, however, was Tongue of the Fat Man, a 1989 MS-DOS quote-unquote fighting game that, at the time of release, wasn't received as negatively as you may think. Many review outlets and magazines at the time certainly did call it out for being clunky and having box art that could have only been designed by a raving, drooling madman, but it wasn't regarded as some kind of worst game of the year style contender, and in fact it even received a little bit of praise for its weirdness and the novelty of its premise. This is perhaps because loads of weird experimental games were always coming out for the PC all the time, with many of them being slow and clunky, as even the concept of smooth screen scrolling was rare for the PC in the late 80s. And at the end of the day, it was just another title to come out of Brian A. Rice Inc., a 15-person team out of Chicago that was headed up by who else but Brian A. Rice, who was Fatman's programmer and who also worked on dozens and dozens of other games throughout the 80s and 90s. The Commodore 64 port, renamed to Mondu's Fight Palace, obviously did nothing to raise the game's profile, as the Commodore wasn't really known for fluid fighting game mechanics, snappy controls, and obviously appealing color palettes. Now, obviously, Brian A. Rice and Activision moved on from the no success of Tongue of the Fat Man and started to look towards other projects, as any of us would. There was, however, another particular company that saw some potential in re-releasing and reprogramming Tongue of the Fat Man for another market entirely, and that was for the up-and-coming Sega Genesis. Now, if you are a purveyor of the doldrums of the Genesis library, you'll be intimately familiar with this logo right here, which of course belonged to Razeroft, and of course adorn the intro/attract sequence of good old Fatman, Slaughter Sport. See, in probably one of their very few smart decisions when it came to this project, Razeroft had a brand new, much more Genesier box art made, and of course changed the title too, but unfortunately, they failed to make many improvements elsewhere when it came to the game. In fact, Razeroft are probably only remembered for two things: the publishing of our contender today, and immediately following that release, their legal spat with Sega, which resulted in a lawsuit and then a counter-lawsuit in 1991, which suspended all of their output on the Genesis for over a year until things were finally settled out of court, as they often are. And while Razeroft was the only logo visible in Slaughter Sport itself, it was in actuality ported and reprogrammed by a small team named Punk Developments, which was essentially the rank and file programmers and artists that Razeroft employed. That is, of course, until they no longer were. Immediately after the release of Slaughter Sport, Punk Developments broke away from Razeroft and went independent, which of course is very punk. Do you know what's not as punk as that, though? Renaming themselves to Iguana Entertainment, selling themselves to Acclaim for millions and millions of dollars, establishing Retro Studios, jerk around Nintendo, barely make any progress on any of their games, crash some cars, get fired, and then release one final title of very, very dubious moral intent before leaving the industry altogether, and hopefully forever. Yes, Punk Developments was founded by the human jar of moldy mayonnaise that is Jeff Spangenberg. I couldn't imagine an origin story for Slaughter Sport more appropriate. Messy, sleazy, and very, very ugly. Oh hey, speaking of ugly... As you can see, a lot of actual work was done porting Tongue of the Fatman into Slaughter Sport, as its bright colorful graphics and bizarre menus were changed, simplified, and darkened into something far more dingy. And while they're both hideous for very different reasons, the main introductory screen that prominently features Mondu shows that the actual rendering of the characters are a good deal more appealing than the MS-DOS original, especially these ripped dudes in the back and this shapely green baddie you see here. I mean, I'm not one to kink shame, but I think that's certainly less off-putting than the striped mermaid slug homunculus with a face that looks like melted cheese. Of course, you can't say melted cheese, though, without immediately thinking of Mondu right here. Just, who thought this guy would be a villain so good that they could base an entire brand around? He's like this horrible combo of that one TMNT sumo action figure and, like, Rufus.
What? Man, say what? Rufus is the best. Lay off my goat, Matt. Don't disrespect.
Thanks, Justin. Anyway, you better get used to this one screen because you're going to see it pretty much every other minute you decide to subject yourself to Slaughter Sport, because honestly, aside from the in-game matches, it's the only other visual the game has to offer. The menus, or lack thereof, and the UI are all really super basic, under-designed stuff that lacks the weird uniqueness of the PC original and make the matches more boring to look at as a result. Now, the in-game sprites and backgrounds are a bit better. I've definitely seen worse looking 16-bit games, but they are also lacking a lot of style, as the bouts only take place in a few scarce, lifeless arenas that lack any sort of animation or life to them. Music is the same farty bleeps and bloops you'd hear from many early third-party Genesis games, so they can't really hold that against it. And it's pretty much the same when it comes to sound effects, although some of the digitized speech, the majority of which come from Mondu, are pretty fun to hear just for the cheesiness factor.
Welcome to the Fight Palace.
After attempting to climb the ranks over and over again through the same set of characters and their palette swaps over and over again, you finally square up against Mondu with the hope to finally shut his ass or stomach mouth up. Do that, and you are awarded with the exact same screen you've been seeing all game long, with one obvious change. Damn it, Razeroft or Punk Developments, could you not have moved this text box a little? Like, who is this being attributed to? The slug girl? The one dude in the background? Who is saying this? Regardless, it's the only ending Slaughter Sport offers, and it doesn't matter who you clear the game with, it's always the same thing. And given how brief and lame it is, this puts its ending, you know, the big reward you finally earn after countless hours of bouncing, farting, and vomiting, on the same exact level as Pit Fighters. But you know what else is at the same level as Pit Fighter? Okay, so Alright, so Tongue of the Fat Man was almost more of a fighting sim in that you had to bet on yourself. There was a gambling / fight purse subsystem going on, your character had all these stats you needed to track, and was more of a methodically paced thing. Slaughter Sport tried to consoleify that same core gameplay and try to make it play closer to the fighting games of the day. This was pre-Street Fighter II, by the way, and in this task, they failed spectacularly. A lot of those systems were cut, and in its place is a very different and far more stripped down version, but it doesn't play any better because of it. In fact, it's an even more frustrating and boring experience in many ways. First up, there's the roster. There's 8 starting combatants pulled from around the galaxy in a bid to dethrone Mondu from atop his stinky pedestal. We have Rex, Edwina, Guano, har har, Bonaparte, har har har, Robo Chic, Stump, Ramses, Webra, and bringing up the rear, Mondu himself. Now, every one of these characters has a palette-swapped twin, which I am not going to bother to name here, because my time is valuable. Suffice it to say though, it's a cheap way to pad out the roster, as most of them are additions created by Razeroft / Punk Developments, with the only holdovers from Tongue of the Fat Man being Rex, Edwina, Stump, and of course, Rufus. Now, when you are playing versus mode, this menagerie of morons are available from the start, which seems rather impressive at first. It's in the single player mode though, where things get all kinds of messed up, as you only have the option to select Rex from the outset. You then have to beat every other character, and if you do, Mondo then gives you a VIG code, which if you input at the title screen, unlocks that fighter for the arcade mode. But, you know, why? What's the point? I'd sort of get it if it unlocked the characters for play in versus mode, but what purpose does it serve here? And what's worse is that the single player only gives you limited attempts to beat it. Once you've lost just 3 bouts in a row, it's game over, and you have to start again from the bottom. Now I know what you're going to whisper to me. Matt, shh, calm down. Just set the game to easy, baby. No, I exclaim, I can't do that, because much like Pit Fighter SNES, Slaughter Sport doesn't have an option screen. So yeah, if you'd like to tweak even the most basic elements of the game, you can't, because I guess Razeroft felt it was perfect as is. And because of that, the CPU is insanely cheap, able to judge distance and timing perfectly, and has mastered the game's incredibly janky mechanics and feel, while you're just blindly pressing buttons trying to figure out how the hell this is supposed to play. There's one attack button and one sorta special button, so that means you basically have one punch and or kick, and then a slightly weirder attack, like blowing fire, using stretchy hair blades, or just blasting out some stink lines. There's no penalty for spamming these either, and since they're just one button, you can continually do them, which makes everything boil down to just mindless mashing. There is, however, another additional wrinkle to the combat, which is definitely a leg up on Pit Fighter SNES, and that's the inclusion of power-ups you can equip before a bout. There's actually a good variety of these, which lets you bar your opponent from jumping, freezing them in place, reversing their controls, becoming invisible, tripping on an oil slick, etc. You buy these depending on the money you've accrued while fighting during the single player mode, but in Versus, you both get a generous allowance right away, letting you mix and match powers together, which, as an idea, is at least pretty neat, and somewhat functional. You do only get a limited amount of each power though, so once they're gone, the fighting degrades back to pure, unadulterated tedium. But yeah, that's actually it when it comes to the mechanics of Slaughter Sport. It's as plain and as basic as it can be, barring the power-ups. But honestly, while not close to anything decent, it's certainly better than the... Jesus Christ. Okay, so look, Tongue of the Fat Man for DOS does not play well, like I've said it multiple times already. It's super slow, plodding, and confusing to play, as almost every combination of the movement controls and the one attack button produces a different effect, making it hard to remember what does what. Slaughter Sport, on the other hand, since it uses a typical Genesis controller, does make it so things are far simpler to wrap your head around, and it moves at a much snappier pace. That being said, this doesn't make it any more relaxing, chill, interactive, or fun. It's quite the opposite, really. See, unlike Tongue, Slaughter Sport has it, so if you press the back button, you turn around and just start walking away, as you are not locked facing your opponent like in almost every other fighting game ever made. Now, that's circumvented pretty easily in Pit Fighter because you can still walk in any direction and navigate around your opponent to line up your next attack. But here, you constantly find yourself facing the wrong way, but you're still locked on one singular 2D plane. After that, you have to contend with jumping, which for almost every character produces giant forward leaps that have you always sailing over your opponent or going through them with your back now facing them, open to attack. Maybe to accommodate for this, Punk Developments decided to make the playable real estate of each arena massive, so they scroll on almost forever. This often, and when I say often, I mean all the fucking time, means you lose track of one of the fighters, as the screen scrolling can't catch up to most player movement. So this makes for one of the most awkward, poorly playing fighters I've seen in a long time. And while Tongue for DOS is indeed pretty dreadful, this is equally as dreadful, but in a very different and I think worse way. Yeah, I mean, it's faster and the animation is nicer, but it's harder to control overall, as you are constantly taking strays anytime you do pretty much anything. Leading, of course, to a metric fuck ton of frustration. Now, the question remains, is this more frustrating to play than our mighty and perhaps former champion Pit Fighter SNES? Well, let's answer that question right now. This is absolutely our tightest race yet, as each game, Slaughter Sport and the Fighters of the Pit, have both really similar and their own unique negatives that truly set them apart. Slaughter Sport, I think, controls worse, a bizarre mishmash of movement and attacking options that makes bouts extremely long and monotonous. However, they both lack option screens, neither have compelling endings, both single-player ladders are incredibly hard to beat, and they're both extremely unpleasant to look at and listen to. But I think one does have slightly more to offer than the other. Slaughter Sport, at least, has a full lineup of 8 characters. They're all weirdos and they should all be wearing ankle monitors, but at least this roster offers a bit of variety, along with some unique abilities and some decent animation. On top of that, the power-up system gives you something to mess around with for 10 minutes, which is more than I can say about Pit Fighter SNES. Remember, that version cut out a lot of stuff for no reason, like weapons, throwable barrels, the power pill, crowd interactions, and several opponents to boot, and it was released years after Slaughter Sport was. Whew, yeah, so despite a very hard, sweaty, and rather disgusting fight, I think our current and reigning champion still scrapes by the hairs of their oily digitized chest. I have to admit though, if I had reviewed Slaughter Sport years ago, it would have no doubt become a former champion, but now, in big 2025, more than a year into Pit Fighter's historic reign, it doesn't quite topple it. But looking at Grand Trash Masters, I think it's absolutely and a cut above worse than the likes of Final Bout or MK Advance, and for that, it deserves special recognition. So that's why I've decided to rename former champs to the Dregs.
Dreg? What the hell's a dreg? Dreg.
And proudly place Slaughter Sport there alongside its new contemporaries. In the future, if and when Pit Fighter ever gets dethroned, it'll remain on its own separate tier because at this point, it truly deserves it. Whew, and that's it for another vile and violent episode of the worst fighting game. It was definitely a war filled with shadows and succession, and while the streets may still be dangerous, we've at least put today's current contender in its place. But it's only a matter of time before we have to do it all over again. So if you know of any other pugilistic punks who could possibly punch Pit Fighter, let me know in the comments below or over on my social media. And until then, warriors, I'll see you next time on the worst fighting game.